Podcasting from Lake Orion, Michigan, where living is a vacation. It's the Rock Your Wellness Podcast, a bi-monthly podcast about how to rock a healthy approach to living that will supercharge your fitness and energy levels without having to turn your life upside down. And now, here's your host, fitness professional, health coach, and nutrition guru, Chuck Jones.
Howdy folks, and welcome to episode 4 of the Rock Your Wellness Podcast. As always, I am your host, Chuck Jones, and I am here today to talk to you about sugar. So before we get started though, I want to let you know about a couple new things going on here. First is, got the launch of the new Rock Your Wellness Now website. So just what it sounds like, www.rockyourwellnessnow.com. And right now it's pretty basic. You've got some links to all the preceding podcasts. You've got some resources of some fitness partners we have. Definitely check them out. Got some great local business owners that do an awesome job with training. And then also have some recommendations on some healthy snacks, some kind of, some gadgets you can get. We talked about it on our sleep episode, some links to those types of things. And also really excited to note that now there are going to be podcast show notes. So, basically you can download a full transcription of the podcast, and when I cite specific studies or, make some specific claims, I'm going to throw some links up in the show notes. So that way, if you're driving or you're out and about, you don't have to worry about scratching things down. You can just go ahead, take a look at the show notes, and go ahead and, check out some links. Make sure I'm not just making stuff up, right? So be sure to check out rockyourwellnessnow.com. All right, so back to the episode number 4, sugar. Why do a whole episode about sugar? I mean, hey, it's just a simple carb, right? What's the big deal? I mean, if you're, if you're working out, you're actively burning off carbs and sugar through exercise, I mean, what's the harm, right? Well, as we are going to go into some detail below, I would actually argue that added sugar probably one of the single most harmful ingredients in our modern diet. Aside from making us fat, it's basically the root to a ton of modern disease states, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, high blood pressure, stroke, gallbladder, liver disease, even osteoarthritis. And by the way, it actually can contribute to premature aging, like sort of dry and wrinkled skin through a process called glycation. So yeah, just a little something to be aware of there. Not so benign, clearly. And according to the CDC, over the past 100 years, America's sugar intake has actually doubled from about 112 grams a day to over 225 grams a day for the average American. So, over 50% of our population has doubled their sugar intake. And contrast that back to like 1800s where average consumption was about 22 grams a day. And then kind of keep in mind the FDA throws out a maximum recommended daily intake of 125 grams. Well, we were eating that 100 years ago, and again, we've doubled that now. I think it's kind of funny. Even Mary Poppins, right? She just recommended a teaspoon of sugar, which, by the way, is about 4 grams. So, going by grams, the average American now is consuming 56 teaspoons of sugar a day. A little too sweet even for Mary Poppins. So, kind of easy though to see, I guess, how or why this has happened really. 80% of packaged food that you'll find in the grocery store has added sweeteners. And just, like a single 20-ounce soda, it's every checkout aisle, right? You got the little, impulse grab there, cooler. 17 teaspoons of sugar in a single 20-ounce soda. And, by the way, bottle of ketchup, if you could get like a visual on what it looked like, how much sugar, 2/3 of that bottle is sugar. So actually not that many tomatoes in there after all. And I mean, listen, big food, they are smart, man. They are totally, totally playing on the fact that we as humans are programmed to seek out sweet. I mean, 2/3 of our taste buds on our tongues actually are there to detect sweet. And, so that might sound like, well, aren't we, supposed to eat sugar? It's like, well, yeah, thousands of years ago we were. But then again, there wasn't much sweet, there weren't many sweet things available for us to grab. And basically, we were it was a couple of times a year when fruit actually ripened, and we would seek it out to kind of prepare for winter, just like animals do, and throw on a few extra pounds and make us a little bit more robust when food got a little bit more scarce. So, not really an excuse for eating so much sugar nowadays. But instead of taking my word for it, why does actually consuming all this excess sugar cause all these problems? So I think, Dave Letterman had a pretty good concept years ago when he had his show, right? He did his top 10 list. So we're going to do a little different format today. We're going to do top 10 reasons to avoid sugar. So starting off, number 10, pretty basic one here. Sugar causes tooth decay, right? I mean, come on, how many times you been to your dentist to see, some kind of cartoon graphic of, sugar or something attacking teeth? I mean, it's kind of not really far-fetched. It's kind of how it works. Sugars just basically provide sort of like a super easy digestible energy for the bad bacteria that are in your mouth, and so that lets them multiply, and they start going to work on your enamel. There's actually a 2014 study that attributes sugar consumption as the single cause of tooth decay. So, I mean, again, you want to have nice teeth? Don't eat too much sugar. At the very least, make sure you're brushing your teeth, right? Number 9, added sugar contains no essential nutrients. And I'm sure you've heard this a million times. It's worth repeating. Added sugar. So we're talking sucrose, high fructose corn syrup, all these different names for it that you see in bottles. Really, they're just a whole bunch of calories with no essential nutrients, zero. And that's what's called an empty calorie. That's why we call it an empty calorie. There's no protein, there's no essential fats, there's no vitamins, there's no minerals, there's nothing in sugar. It is just pure energy. So when you get people eating 10, 20, sometimes 30% of their calories as sugar, maybe more, this is a problem. And the reason it's a problem is because that leads to nutrient deficiencies. What you're actually doing at that point is you are replacing calories from, otherwise, potentially nutrient-dense foods, whole foods, etc. And by the way, remember, your body craves nutrients, not necessarily calories, right? So you're replacing those calories with empty sugar calories that are providing no nutrition. And so you're still full at the end of the day because your body's kind of tricked. It got more calories than it wanted or needed, but you're not getting the corresponding nutrition to go along with it. Number 8, sugar is highly, highly, highly addictive. Sugar actually causes a release of dopamine in the reward center of the brain that is not dissimilar from what happens with illegal drugs like cocaine. We'll put a link to that in the notes. That's really the problem with sugar and just a lot of junk foods that have high amounts of added sugar is they cause this massive dopamine release, which is way, way higher than we were ever exposed to from any sort of natural food found in nature. Even the sweetest fruit out there doesn't even remotely compare to this dopamine release. And dopamine is this pleasure-seeking chemical, right? Which is the opposite of serotonin, which is sort of your happy, your contentment chemical. When you get this spike of dopamine, yeah, it feels good, but it's short-lived, and it leads to this craving for it, this seeking behavior where you want this next hit. And again, sugar does this a very similar way that drugs do, and that's why for a lot of people, especially those that have sort of like a propensity for addiction, they can literally become addicted to sugar. So actually for those people, the whole everything in moderation message that I typically subscribe to, maybe not the best of ideas. It might be abstinence, might be really the only thing that works. But the thing is, even for those of us that don't have that addictive personality necessarily, I mean, you still are going to fall prey to that dopamine spike, and then there's just that inherent, I want more. That's why, like, you can eat great the whole week long, and then, you're at the office party and you have a single cookie, and before you know it, like, that tray of cookies is gone, and that's all on you. That's what sugar can do. So, little side note, actually, I'm going to interject this here. I just finished reading a book, this guy, Dr. James Nicolantonio. It's called The Salt Fix. And super interesting stuff. He actually, he's a cardiovascular research scientist, and he actually talks about how in our modern diets, even though we're getting a lot of sodium from like packaged foods and this and that, we're not necessarily getting enough full real salt, which, real salt has actually all of the trace minerals, including things like iodine and magnesium and phosphorus and things like that. If we're just getting like cheap sort of washed out sodium that's in packaged foods, it's not necessarily doing the same thing. And he actually makes the claim that for a lot of people, especially if you have some kind of a sweet tooth, if you actually up your intake of real salt, that can actually help offset those sweet cravings. Specifically, he talks about a product that I started using myself. It's called Redmond's Real Salt. And it's Redmond, Redmonds, Real Salt. I actually put a link to both his book as well as that product on our website, the Rock Your Wellness Now. So check that out if you want to see a little bit more info on that. But pretty interesting stuff there. I've already personally experienced some pretty cool things just from using the Real Salt, both as a pre-workout ergogenic aid and then also just to offset sweet cravings, which I personally have. So. Number 7, jumping down the line here, added sugar is high in fructose, which can actually overload your liver. So in order to sort of understand what's so bad really about sugar, I guess it kind of makes sense to break down what sugar is made of. So before actually sugar enters the bloodstream from the digestive tract, it's actually broken down into 2 simple sugars. So it breaks it down into glucose and fructose. And glucose, this is found pretty much in every living cell on the planet, for that matter. And actually, it's one of those, like, if we don't get it from our diet, our bodies can actually make glucose by breaking down proteins through a process called gluconeogenesis. So glucose is actually somewhat essential for some metabolic functions and for some brain function. That being said, fructose, completely different animal. Our bodies really don't produce it in any significant amount at all, and in fact, there is zero physiological or biological need for it. We don't need fructose, period. And the problem with fructose is that it can only be metabolized by the liver when it's present in any sort of significant amount. So not a problem, if we're eating, just like having eating an apple, like a small serving of fruit, right? Or also, like if we just finished exercising or some intense, weightlifting or something like that, fructose in those cases is just going to be turned into glycogen. It'll be stored in the liver until we need it for energy. The problem is if the liver is full of glycogen, which is pretty common if we're already eating a lot or more than we're using for energy, it actually overloads the liver and then forces the liver to turn that fructose into fat. Okay? So when you're just eating again and again and again large amounts of sugar, you're not doing intense exercise to burn that off, or even if you are, you're eating more sugar than you're exercising for, that's what actually leads to fatty liver and, frankly, a whole host of serious problems from there. Again, I don't want to demonize fruit here. This doesn't necessarily apply to fruit. I mean, at least doesn't typically, okay? Fruit is pretty fiber dense. It's pretty nutrient dense. It's, generally speaking, you're not going to overeat fruit. Like, you're not going to eat a whole bag of apples, right? So it's typically not going to be providing a level of fructose that's going to overload your liver. Even still, though, I would still argue fruit should always be considered sort of nature's dessert and just kind of, treat it as that, eaten in moderation. Like I kind of mentioned earlier, just keep in mind, animals in the wild and sort of, arguably what we used to do thousands of years ago was to eat fruit to fatten up for the winter. So, again, just keep that in mind if you're consuming copious amounts of fruit and wondering why you aren't losing weight if that's your goal. So number 6, if we're overloading the liver with fructose, that can actually cause non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So when fructose gets turned into fat in the liver, most of that is shipped out as these cholesterol particles that are called very low density LDL particles, and these are the really problematic ones. These are the small particles that sort of ram into the artery walls and can cause inflammation and lead to atherosclerosis. So that's bad enough, but on top of that, not all the fat even gets out, and some of it can actually lodge in the liver, and that is what leads to this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And what does that do? Well, that actually causes the liver to swell, which is this state of hepatitis, basically. And then a swollen liver can actually cause scarring, and that's what's called cirrhosis. And we probably all remember from 9th grade health class, cirrhosis is typically something that alcoholics get, right? Well, not limited just to alcoholics. If you're eating too much sugar, particularly in the form of fructose, then you are absolutely at risk of getting the same disease that an alcoholic has, which can lead to liver cancer or even liver failure. So kind of a big deal there. Number 5, sugar can cause insulin resistance. Every time you eat sugar, insulin is released, and it actually spikes, and what that does is the insulin then transports that sugar from the bloodstream, as blood sugar into cells, and then it tells those cells to start burning that glucose instead of burning fat. So number 1, you can see right there, if your goal is to lose weight and you're trying to burn fat, well, eating sugar immediately shuts off that mechanism. So you are no longer burning fat, you're burning carbs, is the long and short of it. That's why these low-carb diets can be such an effective weight loss tool, since you're not spiking insulin pretty much at any time, you're more or less always in a fat-burning mode. That's how that works. I don't know if anyone really understood or knew that, but it pretty much is as simple as that. But having too much glucose in the blood, that's a super, super big deal. I mean, that can actually lead to things like blindness as a complication from diabetes. So that's why every time you eat sugar, insulin is released. The issue is you eat too much sugar, release too much insulin time and time and time again, the insulin kind of just stops working like it should, because the cells actually, they just kind of start to ignore it. And that's where this insulin resistance comes about, from the cells becoming resistant to the insulin. So, leading on to number 4, insulin resistance can progress to type 2 diabetes. So, when our cells actually become fully resistant to that insulin, what happens? Well, the pancreas, actually the beta cells in our pancreas, just start making more insulin, right? And again, this is super important, because having too much, blood sugar, or having, chronically elevated levels of blood sugar, that's what leads to really bad stuff. But what happens is, as this insulin resistance gets worse and worse and worse, and the pancreas keeps cranking out more and more insulin and higher amounts, pancreas eventually says, I can't keep up, man. And this whole demand of producing enough insulin to keep bringing the blood sugar levels down, it just gives up. And what happens when it gives up? Well, I mean, blood sugar levels, boom, go through the roof, and poof, type 2 diabetes. That's the diagnosis right there. So type 2 diabetes, I mean, this is super preventable. Let's just cut down on the sugar. And oh, by the way, if you get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, I'm not going to say you can cure yourself. That's a pretty bold statement. But you can basically go into, forever remission by just not eating sugar and things that spike insulin. So something to keep in mind there. Also, here's a little stat too. You talk about not drinking your calories. And I've used the phrase, I call fruit juice, diabetes in a glass. Well, 83% higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes is seen by people that drink sugar-sweetened beverages. So we're not just talking about soda here, Pepsi, Coke, etc. We're talking about what seemingly benign, Welch's fruit juice or whatever, right? I mean, it's just sugar in a glass. That's all it is. Yeah, it might have a couple of vitamins in it, but that's it, man. So be really, really, really careful with the fruit juice, with the soda. Don't drink your calories. Don't get type 2 diabetes. Number 3, sugar makes you fat. Yeah, I mean, we talked a couple weeks ago about how not all calories are, created equal. And you sort of have how, like, different foods can actually have different effects on our brains and on the hormones that tell us we're full and tell us, that we're hungry. Fructose does not have the same kind of effect on satiety as glucose does. And here's an example. There was a study, and I'll put this in the notes. You had basically 2 groups. First group, people drank a fructose-sweetened drink, and the second group, people drank a glucose-sweetened drink. And afterwards, they measured levels of, or actually activity in like the satiety centers of the brain, and then they also measured levels of the hormone ghrelin, which is the hormone that tells you you're hungry, and the hormone leptin, which is the hormone that tells you you're full. Well, the fructose drinkers had way less activity in their brain's satiety centers and felt hungrier than the glucose drinkers. And surprise, surprise, ghrelin was not reduced nearly as much, and that's the hormone that tells you you're hungry. And leptin, the hormone that tells you you're full, was not increased by the fructose drinkers versus the glucose. So basically, the fructose drinkers didn't get full, and they still felt hungry versus the glucose drinkers. Again, that's why you can kind of drink like an entire 2 liter of Pepsi or Coke and kind of not feel full, even though you just consumed a whole ton of calories, right? So really, really, I think basic descriptor of how sugar can make you fat, because you're not going to get full. You're not going to get the proper, hunger signals from your brain. Number 2. Sugar raises your cholesterol levels and leads to heart disease. And this is where, again, stemming from a couple weeks ago, we talked about, for decades, people have this saturated fat. It's been this fat's been this 4-letter word, right? And especially saturated fat. Totally blamed for heart disease, which, by the way, is the number 1 killer in the world still. And then, of course, we've got all these new studies that have come out saying, actually, saturated fat, pretty harmless. Actually, a limited amount from good sources, pretty healthful part of a diet, because it doesn't oxidize. Surprise, surprise! Wow, what a cool concept. However, it's the idea that sugar, not fat, is actually one of the leading drivers now of heart disease. Is what's coming to light, and it's again primarily due to the whole effect of fructose specifically on metabolism. There's studies that show how large amounts of fructose can actually raise triglycerides. So we talked about these small, dense, these very dense, low, LDL particles that are oxidized, and that's super bad because those are the particles that lead to atherosclerosis. But it raises blood glucose and insulin levels, increases the abdominal, specifically obesity area, in as little as 2 weeks. 10 weeks. 10 weeks. 2 weeks that's pretty crazy. Although you're going to see some effects, but 10 weeks, still a small period of time. And all of these things I just mentioned are all major risk factors for heart disease. So I mean, it's not fat, it's the sugar that's leading to those issues. So, number one leads us to our number one. It's not quite as funny or as exciting as the Letterman's Top 10 list. Sugar can give you cancer. What is cancer? I mean, obviously it's one of the leading causes of death worldwide, pretty much right behind heart disease. But what it really is, it's like this uncontrolled growth or like a multiplication of cells, right? And then insulin is sort of this key hormone that regulates this type of growth. So that's why scientists now are saying that, well, yeah, if someone has these constantly elevated insulin levels as a result of eating, too much sugar or eating sugar all the time, that's what can actually contribute to cancer. Yes, we'll put a link in the show notes for that. It's not necessarily the sugar itself that's causing the cancer, but it's the catalyst for nudging like this uncontrolled cell or tumor growth through the release of insulin. So insulin's this hormone that it's a powerful growth hormone. So I'm going to put links too for some multiple studies that just show that people that eat a lot of sugar are at a much higher risk of getting cancer. So if the previous 9 reasons aren't reason enough to watch your intake of excess sugar, hopefully number 1 is plenty of reason by itself. So I mean, it's no secret that we love sugar. We talked about we're programmed to detect sweet. 2/3 of our taste buds detect sweet. I mean, it's rewarding, right? And frankly, I mean, having a little bit from time to time, hey, ice cream cone on a hot summer night, hey, that's awesome, man. That's a perfectly fine thing. We indulge ourselves. I just think it's sometimes it's hard to realize truly the amount of sugar that you do eat on a day-to-day basis. And again, these food companies, they're so smart. They're sneaking it in there to make things, super hyper palatable and turn on your dopamine receptors and have you crave more and buy more. So, I mean, hopefully now, just having this awareness of how much added sugar you're actually eating, I'm hoping that this just kind of opens our eyes. We're a little bit more aware. We make some better decisions. Here's a super hack just to remember. If you take nothing else from this podcast, take this. Just as a really simple, effective strategy for reducing your overall sugar intake. Don't drink your calories. Okay, cut out the soda, cut out the fruit juice, cut out the Jamba juices and all these things which just have all this extra fruit in it. You do that alone, you will be well on your way to representing the low end of the curve, where, as the USDA says, the average American consumes 150 to 170 pounds of sugar every year. Yeah, that's right. The average American's eating a person worth of sugar every year. So don't drink your calories. It's going to help you out huge with that. And oh, by the way, keep this in mind. Drinking just 1 can of an actual sugar sweetened soda per day with no other dietary changes. So if everything else is relatively in check and on par and you're good, can actually lead to excess weight gain of 10 to 15 pounds in a single year. So yeah, just don't drink it. Don't drink those calories. So thank you so much again for listening, folks. And by the way, thank you for your emails. I've been listening to your feedback. I've been making some adjustments. Hopefully you've noticed. I definitely appreciate that, and I'm taking it to heart. And also, I've actually received a few specific questions about training and nutrition. So next week, we're going to kind of jump to a little different format, and I'm actually going to spend some time answering, some of your listener questions. So please keep the feedback, keep those questions coming. Email me directly, okay? So if you have comments, feedback, ideas for the show, if you a guest you want to have on the show, chuck@rockyourwellnessnow.com. That's my email. Send them all to me. It comes straight to me. I'll read every single one of them. Promise to read every single one of them. So again, it's Chuck at rockyourwellnessnow.com. And again, that'll just give me that feedback that I can use to continue to improve the show, make sure we're covering topics that you want to hear more about. So, and I know I keep beating this this dead horse here, but if you like the show, please make sure to take the time to log on to iTunes, give us a good rating. Actually, go on and leave some feedback if you would. Post some notes that you like the show. Makes a huge difference, guys. And be sure also to check out our new website now, which is rockyourwellnessnow.com. So, until next time, God bless and keep on rocking. See you in a couple of weeks.